Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're digging into the story of the Sackler family, the dynasty behind the painkiller OxyContin, and how their ambition and deception fueled the American opioid crisis. It's a heck of a story with some really devastating consequences.
So, where does a story like this even begin? Well, it's not in some fancy boardroom. It starts in a place like this, Creedmoor Psychiatric Hospital, back in the 1940s. This was a time of just brutal treatments for mental illnesses that nobody really understood. For patients, the options were, well, they were terrifying. I mean, think about it. Procedures like the lobotomy, they were actually common. And right in the middle of all this, you've got three young brothers, Arthur, Mortimer, and Raymond Sackler. They worked there, and they personally administered thousands of rounds of another brutal treatment, electroshock therapy. Now, after seeing all of this horror firsthand, the brothers came to a conclusion. They thought, this isn't a moral failing. This is a problem with brain chemistry. And a chemical problem? Well, that needs a chemical solution, a pill. And that one single idea, that's what set them on the path to buying a small drug company called Purdue. And it would change everything. Okay, so they have this big idea, this ambition. But how do you turn that into a billion-dollar empire? That's where the Sackler playbook comes in. To really get how this crisis started, we have to look at the guy who wrote that playbook, the eldest brother, Arthur Sackler. You see, he didn't just sell drugs, he completely revolutionized how they were sold. Arthur's tactics were honestly kind of brilliant, but also completely unethical. I mean, get this, he paid doctors to be his salesmen, using their credibility as a weapon. He created ads with ringing endorsements from medical professionals who didn't even exist, and it worked. He took a drug like Valium, meant for severe anxiety, and made it seem like an everyday solution for housewives. And boy, did he get rich doing it. So, what happens when people inevitably start getting hooked on these tranquilizers? You'd think there'd be some soul-searching, right? Nope. Arthur's response was chillingly simple. He basically said, it's not the drug's fault, it's the patient's fault. I want you to remember that line, because that idea, blaming the user, becomes the family motto for decades. Now, Arthur actually passed away before the opioid crisis really blew up, but that playbook he created, it didn't die with him. The next generation of Sacklers took it, they perfected it, and they used it to launch something way, way more dangerous. Okay, fast forward to the 1990s. The family's got a problem. Their big moneymaker, a morphine pill called OxyContin, is about to go generic. Profits are going to tank. They need a new blockbuster, and they need it fast. So what do? They take this really powerful opioid, oxycodone. We're talking chemically similar to heroin here. And they stick it into their special Contin slow-release pill. And boom, they call it OxyContin. But wait a second. This is basically heroin in a pill. Doctors at the time knew to be really careful with opioids. So how on earth did Purdue convince the entire medical world that this one was different, that it was safe enough not just for cancer patients, but for your average person with back pain? Well, it all came down to getting real cozy with their regulator at the FDA. This is just wild. The guy at the FDA in charge of reviewing OxyContin, a man named Curtis Wright, he basically lets Purdue help write its own approval. He signs off on this crazy, unheard-of phrase for the label, saying it's believed to be less addictive. Believed by who? There was no science. But that little phrase became Purdue's single greatest marketing tool. And the punchline? A little over a year later, where does Curtis Wright end up? With a high-paying job at Purdue, of course. So now they have it, a golden ticket, a label that basically says FDA-approved safe-ish. And with that, Purdue unleashed one of the most aggressive and frankly fraudulent sales campaigns this country has ever seen. And this right here, this was their magic bullet, their killer line. They sent an army of sales reps, most with zero medical training, all over the country. They had huge bonuses, they bought doctors fancy lunches, and they all hammered home this one single, powerful, and completely deceptive statistic. So you're a doctor, you hear less than 1% addiction rate, you're thinking, okay, there must be a big, solid, peer-reviewed study behind this, right? Some serious science. Yeah, the reality was something else entirely. You're not going to believe this. The source for that less than 1% claim, it was a 5-sentence letter to the editor of a medical journal from 1980. It wasn't a real study, it wasn't even about OxyContin, and it was only looking at patients who were already in a controlled hospital setting. Purdue found this tiny, irrelevant little note and turned it into a weapon to push a dangerously addictive drug on millions of people. Okay, so pretty quickly, doctors start calling in. They're like, hey, my patients are getting sick. They're showing withdrawal symptoms. This pill doesn't actually last the full 12 hours. So what does Purdue do? They come up with this absolutely genius and totally cynical concept. They called it pseudo-addiction. They told doctors, oh, they're not really addicted. They're just still in pain. The solution? Give them a higher dose. Meanwhile, out in the real world, people are overdosing. The drug is getting a street name, hillbilly heroin. The crisis is exploding. And what's the family's internal strategy? We know from Richard Sackler's own emails. It wasn't to find a solution. It was, and a quote, to hammer on the abusers. So you see the game, right? Publicly, they're pointing the finger at reckless criminals. But the truth is, their own marketing created these so-called abusers. They told doctors to prescribe more, and then, when patients got hooked, exactly as you'd expect, the family turned around and branded them as criminals. So what about the aftermath? What about justice? Well, the legal system tried to step in, and what happened next reveals just how deep the damage really was, and just how hard it is to hold people like this accountable. All right, so in 2007, Purdue finally gets caught. They plead guilty to a felony for fraudulent marketing. They get a $600 million fine. And that sounds like a ton of money, right? But look at this. In that same year, they made $3 billion from OxyContin. That fine wasn't a punishment. It was just the cost of doing business. It was like a speeding ticket. And of course, not a single member of the Sackler family went to jail. And this is how they protected their fortune. After making over $35 billion from this drug, they knew the lawsuits were coming. So for about a decade, they just started pulling money out of the company. Over $10 billion moved into their personal offshore accounts. So when thousands of lawsuits finally arrived, Purdue just declared bankruptcy. It was an empty shell. Then the Sacklers came back and said, okay, we'll pay a few billion, but in exchange, you can never sue us again. Ever. And the tragedy is, the crisis didn't just end there. The damage was done. When doctors finally started cutting back on OxyContin prescriptions, what happened to the millions of people who were already addicted? They turned to the streets. They turned to heroin. And the numbers are just staggering. 4 out of every 5 new heroin users in that era started their journey with a prescription pill, just like OxyContin. This all adds up to a public health disaster it's just hard to even wrap your head around. The overdose deaths just kept climbing and climbing until we reached the grim new reality we live in today. More Americans are now killed by opioids than by car crashes or by guns. So here's the bottom line, the most important thing to take away from all this. The opioid crisis wasn't some random tragedy. It wasn't a natural disaster. It was the direct result of a family's business plan, a plan that chose profit over people, sold a lie, and then blamed the very people it hurt. And that leaves us with a really big, really important question. What should happen when a company's pursuit of profit creates a national epidemic? And what does justice even look like then?